is research and development tax relief. And the idea today really is to sort of get a state of the nation. Where are we now with R&D tax relief? But before we go on to that, if I can get these slides to move on, which they were doing earlier. That's good. There we go. I thought it would be a good idea to start by just looking at a refresher of what R&D tax relief we actually have at the moment. And so we can start off with the small and medium-sized entity, or SME, SME R&D tax relief. We have the Research and Development Expenditure Credit, or RDEC. And I just want to put in a quick mention as well of the R&D Capital Allowance, which can be claimed for any fixed assets that are used in research and development. We don't tend to see it a lot at the moment because the annual investment allowance at £1 million is very generous when it comes to plant and machinery. But it's worth bearing in mind the R&D capital allowance if you're carrying out an infrastructure project, so perhaps building a new research and development facility. And also you've got to bear in mind as well that the first two reliefs, the tax reliefs, are only available for companies. The capital allowance is available for everyone. So then we can move on. Going on to now the SME R&D tax relief. This is the one that gets companies really excited because it is very generous. The impact, in effect, is instead of giving a £1 deduction for each pound of R&D expenditure, qualifying expenditure, it gives the company £2.30 tax deduction. So the £1 they'd get anyway, plus an extra 130%. So instead of, say, a company who spent £100 on R&D, instead of them getting a tax deduction of £19, they actually get a tax deduction worth £43.70. So that's, you know, a big additional reduction in tax. In a way, you can say even better, if the company's got losses, it can surrender its R&D losses to HMRC for a cash credit that's the equivalent of £33.35 for each £100 of qualifying cost. And certainly over the years, I've seen a lot of companies take advantage of that. And if we move on again, hopefully, yep. The SME R&D tax relief is only available to SMEs, as you'd expect, but as you can see from these tests, that can include some very large companies. Basically, to qualify, the company's got to meet the employee test and one of the other two. Although you do need to bear in mind, if we move on again to the next slide, that those size tests apply not just to the company that's making the claim, but also to any linked companies, which are those where there's a relationship of more than 50%, or partner enterprises where the relationship is between 25% and 50%. And we're not just talking about the usual concept of a tax group here, where you're looking at a holding company and its subsidiaries. In this case, you can also have companies that are linked or partner enterprises where the link is through a natural person. So if you think of Dr. X sets up a number of companies to carry out R&D, if those companies are all working in similar fields, then they're all going to be linked to each other. And so you'd have to take them all into account when looking at the size tests. Other areas, and we'll touch on these in more detail later, that you need to be aware of for SMEs is that if they have funded projects, then that can affect the claim. If the funding is a notified state aid, then the whole of the project drops out of the SME R&D tax relief. Other types of subsidy will knock out the subsidised costs only, but if there are costs that are unfunded in the project, then the SME relief remains available on those costs. And also, if the SME is acting as a subcontractor for a third party, then it cannot claim the SME tax relief. If its customer is an SME, they will claim the SME relief instead. And then we'll go on to see what happens if the customer isn't an SME a bit later. I've also thrown in, I just mentioned the the cap that there is on very large SME claims. We see that very rarely, but the total amount of tax reliefs that can be claimed under SME R&D tax relief on a single project is 7.5 million euros. So as I say, we don't come across that very often. Moving on, the slides I think anticipated this a bit, to the RDEC. This is less generous. It's also a bit more complicated to explain because instead of giving an enhanced deduction, how the RDEC works is you look at the company's qualifying R&D costs and then take a 13% taxable credit equal based on those costs. So if the company has spent £100,000 on R&D, it would get an RDEC of £13,000, which would be added to its taxable profit. Well, that sounds bizarre, you're paying additional tax. But what happens then is once the corporation tax liability has been calculated, the £13,000 of RDEC comes back into play and reduces the tax liability. So in effect, the company's tax liability is being reduced by £10.53 for each £100 of qualifying R&D expenditure. If the company's not paying tax at all, there are various things you can do, but the one we see most often is that the RDEC is then given up for a cash credit, which is equal again to that £10.53 for each £100 of qualifying costs. So effectively the net of tax value of the RDEC. So, you know, it's not as generous, but it's there. And RDEC is available to, if we can go down to the next slide, possibly, yep. Companies that aren't SMEs, that's fairly clear. But some SMEs also can claim RDEC. Those are the ones with subsidised projects where the subsidies are notified state aid. So the whole of the project then goes into RDEC. Likewise, if there are non-state aid subsidised costs, those costs can be subject to an RDEC claim. So the company isn't missing out entirely. And also, if the company is an SME that's acting as a subcontractor to non-SMEs, so that's UK large companies or overseas customers, whether they're large or SMEs, again, the company can claim RDEC on those projects. Moving on a bit. For all three of the R&D tax reliefs that I've mentioned, the definition of R&D is the same. And there are really four key features. The research or development must be in the fields of science or technology. It's got to be creating new knowledge, not catching the company up to the existing state of knowledge that's already out there. It's got to give rise or be aimed at giving rise to an appreciable advance in scientific or technological knowledge. And in making that advance, the company must be having to resolve scientific or technological uncertainty. So moving on. HMRC historically has applied really a light touch to looking at R&D claims, but we have seen inquiries into claims over the years. And from those, we can see that where HMRC's focus tends to be, in particular, it's important to bear in mind that what HMRC are looking at is not what the end product does, but actually the features of the project. So you're looking at, does the project actually create new knowledge? Not, are you creating a product that's new to the world? Then we've got the competent professional test. And this is going to be very important in one of the tax cases that we're going to look at a bit later. And this is the concept of asking, would a competent professional in this field recognise that there is an appreciable improvement in the state of knowledge in that area? And with the question of the technological uncertainty that's faced, would that competent professional be able to resolve that technological uncertainty fairly easily? So that's something to bear in mind as well. Subsidies have also been cropping up again and again, and again, we'll look at that in more detail a bit later. I think it's also worth mentioning that for SMEs who haven't claimed R&D tax relief before, provided their turnover doesn't exceed £1.5 million, there is an advanced clearance process they can go through to get some advance assurance that their R&D is going to qualify. And finally, I wanted to shine a light as well on going concern, because obviously that's quite a hot topic at the moment. And just to remind you that a company can only claim either RDEC or SME R&D tax relief if it is a going concern at the time it makes the claim. And also, and here's sort of a nasty little catch, the reason it's a going concern is not merely that it's expecting to receive R&D tax relief. And obviously that is relevant in the current circumstances we found ourselves in because of COVID. So moving on to the next slide, talking about COVID, HMRC has given us some guidance on how the various COVID measures affect R&D claims. So looking first of all at the furlough scheme, this is not a notified state aid, which is good news, but it is a subsidy. So that means any costs covered by the furlough scheme cannot fall into an SME claim. They can only go into RDEC. However, of course, one of the conditions of furlough is that the employee mustn't be performing any duties for their employer. So to that extent, you wouldn't expect to see furlough payments in an R&D claim anyway, because they're not R&D costs. But you do need to bear in mind that employees on furlough are still allowed to take holiday, they're still allowed to take sick leave. And historically, HMRC, when looking at R&D claims, has allowed a portion of sick leave and holiday proportionate to the amount of R&D performed by the employee as being included in qualifying costs. So in that case, if you've got an employee who was furloughed for part of the year, and during that part of the year, they took some holiday, they had some sick leave, so that there are some costs attributable to their R&D activities in the rest of the year, those costs can only be claimed under RDEC. In contrast to that, if you have payments under the COVID sick pay rebate scheme, that is a notified state aid. So if any employee working on a project was off sick and rebate claims were made, then that unfortunately is going to knock the whole project out of SME and into RDEC. And the same goes for the various COVID support loans. They are state aids. So if they've been used to fund an R&D project, only RDEC is available on that project. So moving on again. Another victim of COVID, in a way, was the return of the PAYE NIC cap, because we were expecting this to happen on the 1st of April 2020. But of course, because everything was thrown up in the air 12 months ago, this was put on hold. It's a measure that's being introduced as a response to perceived exploitation of certain weaknesses in the R&D legislation, which has allowed unscrupulous companies to set up structures that benefit from R&D tax relief in a way that's, without having any real substance. So the idea is to say that, well, if you're going to claim cash under the SME scheme, it's got to be backed up by substance in the form of having employees. It's slightly more generous than the old PAYE NIC cap, in that it only kicks in once the cash claim exceeds £20,000. And if the company is, it's a genuine R&D company, it is carrying on genuine R&D, and it's not spending a lot of its R&D expenditure on related party subcontractor or externally provided worker costs, then the cap's not going to apply in that case either. But if you've got a company that doesn't meet those requirements, it has a low employee base, it's spending a lot on subcontracting out its R&D, then the amount of cash that it can claim if it's a loss-making company is capped at 3 times its PAYE and NIC liability for the relevant year. So, it probably isn't going to bite quite as widely as we feared when this was first announced, but you still need to be aware of it if you fit that fact pattern. Then moving on again. HMRC have been making noises over the last few years that they are concerned that their former light touch approach on R&D claims has led to a proliferation of overly aggressive claims, in some cases fraudulent claims. We've had, in the last year, 6 R&D fraudsters have been jailed, and there are further investigations ongoing. There have been other arrests, including in this region. So there will be more court cases coming. And there's also been concern among HMRC and also among reputable R&D advisors about a proliferation of, if we call them, sort of opportunist R&D specialist firms. As you can see, I'm making reference here to a Taxation magazine article at the start of this year, which was discussing the fact that a lot of firms aren't aware that the market for R&D tax advice is largely unregulated. So anyone can set up and make claims. A lot of those specialist firms are highly reputable, but some of them are not. And so you always need to bear in mind that old adage that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And HMRC are taking action to combat these overly aggressive claims, and we are seeing that feeding through into tax cases. So if we move on, we're going to wrap up really by looking at 3 recent tax cases. First of these, Tech Solutions Inc. This was the first one that came through. It's a bit of an odd case because really it shouldn't have gone to the tribunal. The point was that Tech Solutions put in its R&D claims. HMRC came along and said, well, we can't see how these costs tie into your profit and loss account, so we want to see some evidence to back it up. The director of Tech Solutions said, oh, well, I can't give you any evidence because I've lost all my business emails. They've all been deleted and I can't get them back. They've been deleted by my email provider and I can't get them back. He took this case to tribunal. The tribunal found that if you cannot provide evidence that you've incurred the costs and that the costs are properly deductible for tax purposes, then surprise, surprise, you cannot claim R&D tax relief on them. So that was the first case. Moving on to the next one, which is AHK Recruitment Limited. This sort of is another step on that same sort of journey. AHK Recruitment Limited, as it sounds, was a recruitment company. They had developed some technology for analysing recruitment data. They put in a claim. HMRC said, tell us a bit more about this technology and why you think it meets the requirements to be R&D for tax purposes. And they couldn't provide that information because none of the people who'd been involved in the development were still at the company at that stage. And there were no contemporaneous notes explaining why the development was thought to be R&D for tax purposes. And so again, the tribunal really had no alternative but to say, well, we can't allow this claim. So again, it's the importance of having contemporaneous evidence to back up your claim and being able to provide that to HMRC. And this case as well looked at the question of the competent professional and the idea that the competent professional is somebody who can be internal to the company, and very often the company's technical team, technical head, is going to be the best person to meet that requirement, as long as they've got the relevant academic qualifications and or they're qualified by experience. But as we sometimes see, if you've just got the FD saying, well, we think this qualifies, but they're not hands-on in the R&D, that is not necessarily going to be sufficient for HMRC to accept a claim. So it's important to get the tech guys involved and to get them documenting upfront why they think this project is going to qualify. If we move on to the final one, this is Hady Engineering. And the other two, in a way, the other 2 cases have been about common sense. It's been getting the evidence. Hady Engineering, I find more troubling because what this is looking at is HMRC's approach to how they interpret certain questions. Before we go into the detail, it's worth noting that all these cases, they're first-tier tribunal cases, so they don't create binding precedent. But they are an indication of how HMRC are going to approach these questions. So there are 3 points really in Hady Engineering that we need to be aware of. First of all, R&D is looked at a project basis, and HMRC are applying a narrow definition to a project, and it must be a planned project. So it must have a beginning, a middle and end. It must be documented. There must be a project plan that sets out, this is what we are going to do. We want to achieve this. This is how we're going to go about achieving it. This is what the end result should look like. These are the uncertainties we have identified as needing to resolve. And the fact that the end product is unique does not necessarily mean it is a qualifying R&D project. And HMRC gave the example of building a bridge. Each bridge is unique to its location, to its purpose, to the load it's got to bear. But if that bridge is built using tried and tested engineering methods, the design is tried and tested, then that is not an R&D project, because any competent professional in the field of bridge building could have put that bridge up. So that's two things to bear in mind. And then we get onto the question that really is concerning. And this is looking at the wide definitions of subcontract arrangements and subsidies that HMRC are applying. In looking at a subcontractor arrangement, it's even if the customer agreement for a bespoke project, even if it doesn't say this is a subcontractor agreement, HMRC can interpret it as being a subcontractor agreement depending on the level of customer input. If they are coming up with the specification and having input into the design and how uncertainties are being resolved, then it is likely that HMRC would say that is a subcontractor arrangement and push any claims at best into RDEC, or at worst up to the customer, and if they're an SME, a UK SME. Even if you've not got a subcontractor arrangement, HMRC's approach on other subsidies is interesting, because what they're saying is that if a bespoke project is priced so that the customer is effectively funding the development time, then those costs are subsidised and again are pushed into an RDEC claim. So if you're pricing a project on an hours basis and those hours include the development hours, then that's a subsidy. But more widely than that, HMRC's thinking, as discussed at the R&D Consultative Committee last year, seems to be that if you are setting a project budget that includes development time and you're pricing the project to cover that budget, then the development time is funded. As I say, this is a first-tier tribunal case. It is not binding until we get a case that goes further up to the higher levels. We won't get binding precedent on this, but it is something that you really do need to bear in mind if you are carrying out those bespoke projects. How comfortable are you that the customer isn't funding your development work? Moving on to the final slide, if we can. So, is what I'm saying that R&D's dead in the water? Absolutely not, provided that you are comfortable that your project, or you or a competent professional within your team is comfortable that your project meets the qualifying criteria to be R&D for tax purposes. If you can back up your costs that you're claiming, and if you're comfortable as well that you know which costs are funded and so fall into RDEC, which projects are subcontract projects, so maybe are RDEC or aren't your projects to claim, then as long as you can tick all the right boxes, then R&D tax relief is still a very good tax relief to claim. But always bear in mind that if somebody comes along, gives you the cold call, promises you the earth, if it sounds too good to be true, in your heart of hearts, it probably is. So that's all I wanted to say today. I don't know if you've got any questions. I think we've got a bit of time left to talk over those.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. That was really useful. We've just got one question for you at the moment from Michael. And if anyone else has got any questions, please type them into the Q&A box while we're dealing with this one. So it's, when is R&D relief claimed? And is there any restriction on where the R&D work is carried out?
Right. You claim your R&D tax relief on an accounting period basis. So you're looking at costs undertaken in the accounting period. You have 2 years from the end of the accounting period to put your claim in. So say in the year ended 31st of December 2020 even, you started a new project, you would claim for the costs in that year in your corporation tax return, and you can do that at any time up to 31st of December 2022. And what was the other side?
So is there any restriction on where the R&D work is carried out?
Right.
And sorry, Michael's just added a clarification. Is it okay if the work is done outside the UK?
The work can be done outside the UK. It is only UK companies that can claim. You can subcontract your work out to a company outside the UK or to a subcontractor outside the UK. And as long as you're claiming as an SME, that's fine. If you're claiming RDEC, you can only claim subcontractor costs in certain circumstances where the subcontractor is not a company. So if you were, say, UK company, very large, so you're into RDEC and you're subcontracting your work out to a French subsidiary, you couldn't claim for those costs. But if you're an SME, you could. I hope that answers Michael's question.
I think so. And I think that's all we've got by the looks of things.
Okay. In which case, thank you for your attention. I hope you found it useful. We've got a couple of events coming up next. We've got the budget breakfast on the 5th of March, which obviously we'll find out next week what we'll be talking about then. And on the 9th of March, Helen Carey is going to be talking about VAT and Brexit. So a very big topic indeed. Okay, thank you.